Welcome everybody tonight to the Yale University Art Gallery. My name is Yechen Zhao. I'm the Marsha Brady Tucker Fellow in the Department of Photography. Thank you again for joining us. First things first, I want to start by acknowledging the indigenous peoples and nations of this place, what is now the state of Connecticut. So Yale University was built on land stewarded by the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scottacoke, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquian-speaking people. But further, I want to acknowledge the 5 tribes whose lands are represented in the Exposure Project, which is in this exhibition. Those are the Hopi, the Navajo, the Uintah-Ore Ute, the Ute Mountain Ute, and the Zuni tribes of the Four Corners region in the American Southwest. I'll extend the same to the Bedouins of the Negev Desert in northern Israel, whose lands are represented in erasure. I recognize and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples, these nations, and their lands. It's my pleasure to introduce Fazal Sheikh, whose talk tonight is generously sponsored by the Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund. He is here on the occasion of his exhibition, Fazal Sheikh Exposures, which is on view in the 4th floor special exhibition galleries. The exhibition would not be possible without the generous support of Jane P. Watkins, to whom we extend a very special thanks. The museum is open until 8 p.m. tonight, and so I encourage you all to visit after this event. Fazal Sheikh is an artist who works among displaced and marginalized communities around the world. The principal form for this is the portrait, though his projects also encompass personal narratives, found photographs, sound recordings, archival material, academic essays, and his own written texts. These projects have taken him to places including Kenya, Afghanistan, Somalia, and India. But Fazal will speak tonight on 2 recent, one very recent project that comprised the Exposures exhibition upstairs. He'll speak for about 45 minutes, after which I'll join him on stage to moderate a Q&A conversation with the audience. So please join me in welcoming Fazal Sheikh.
Thank you, Yechen. That was lovely, and I appreciate your reciting the acknowledgments for all parties. I'd like to share some thoughts with you about these 2 projects, particularly those that are on view, Exposure and Erasures. And before I start, there are moments of the presentation which are complicated for me, but this last set of years, in the wake of the kind of community that I've been able to be part of and to gather around me, I've experienced great sort of gestures of generosity and joy, and that I think that spirit is what has been able, has made it possible for me to sustain this endeavor. And in particular, I just wanted to mention my own community, because without them close by, I wouldn't be here this evening. My dear partner Alexandra, who for the last weeks has been with me in the most supportive and generous way, as she has been for many, many years. As well, my dear friends, Jonah Yellowman and his family. He wasn't able to be here tonight, but he's joining us online, and I salute him, I miss him. He should have been here tonight with his own son, Eric, who was going to visit the East Coast for the first time in his life. I'd also like to thank Jeff Moore, who collaborated with me on the project, as well as my dear Terry Tempest Williams, whose invitation actually made all of this work in the Southwest a possibility. I think that when one visits the exhibition, it's so immaculate in its presentation. Envisioned early on by Jock Reynolds and Judy Dittner, and then taken over by the new director, Stephanie Wiles, and Larry Cantor. But in particular, lastly, I'd like to mention Kishwar Rishvi, because in the complexities that I have had in navigating this exhibition and the interactions with Yale, her singular manner of kindness, her direct and incisive judgments, and her facility with navigating that process and generosity with her students has been extraordinary to witness, and I'm very grateful to you for that, Kishwar. I think that in general, I'm wondering about, what is the role of the artists in these times? And I often find that I'm choosing subjects that are so fragile and nuanced in their nature that the possibility for vulnerability or for trespass or for fallibility is very much near the surface. And I commend actually Yale and the gallery for its openness to showing these two bodies of work, both of which are extremely topical, extremely nuanced. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity to share the material with you here. I'd like to actually just speak in a rather informal way about these two projects because they are installed in such a handsome mode up in the galleries. I'll start with a brief set of ruminations about the Erasure project, which is on the top floor. And then I'll move to the exposure piece and the in-place piece, which are works about the American Southwest. But the interesting thing for me is that there is a real corollary between the American Southwest and the work in Israel and Palestine, in particular the work Desert Bloom in the southern part of Israel in the Negev. And this idea of wastelanding, which was brought by Tracy Voiles, which suggests that areas that are deserted, that are remote and inaccessible, are able to be exploited. And by extension, communities who live within that expanse are they themselves expendable. And much of this endeavor has been considering the nature of what those communities have to bring to our sense of the world, the way in which they nurture one another, and what they have taught me, indeed, about my own place in the world. So I start with the Erasure Trilogy. I was invited, along with 10 artists, to spend about 6 or 8 months in Israel and Palestine. This was in 2010. It was a project initiated by Frederick Brenner, a French-Israeli photographer. And at the time, I remember thinking, what an extraordinary invitation. I never would have had that opportunity under other circumstances. But I was indeed wary about what such an invitation might mean. In fact, I was worried about the sense of potentially being instrumentalized, used by nature of my name to fill a particular slot in their agenda. I did, however, agree to an initial set of visits without sort of signing a contract or confirming that I would continue onward. And I went three times under my own steam, just visiting and looking at the areas. I thought initially the important thing to do was to look at 1948, right, the start of the State of Israel. What had it meant for those communities who had previously lived in harmony with one another? And I started by looking at the former Palestinian villages, the hundreds of villages that had been depopulated in the span between 1947 and 1948. Now, one must realize is that to speak about that in the country is somewhat taboo. And I began researching and visiting those spaces, trying to find the remnants of what had been the prior village, the prior inhabitation. Often you would arrive at the site and there was no clue of what had come before. And when I came away that third time, I was sure that this was the kind of thing that resonated with the trajectory of my own work and could carry me forward. But because it was an invitation, I had to say to the initiator, Frederick Brenner, what I was interested in, to ask whether or not this was something that was acceptable to him. And indeed, he gave me complete permission and freedom to pursue it in the manner that I saw fit. This is an image from Deir Rafat in the outskirts of Jerusalem district. And when one arrives at these spaces, as I said, often there is nothing left for us to view. It is there in the coordinates, it is there in the facts, but the remnants of the space left behind are hard to find. This is Anisa Abu Jabr in the refugee camps outside al-Fahim in northern Israel. I realized, though, that there was something extraordinary about the idea of coming from without. I could move between Israel and the Palestinian territories with a degree of facility, a degree of permission, something that neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians could do. And I soon became interested in following this sinuous thread of the memory trace of those who had left behind a place where they were born. Anisa, at the time I met her, was 103 years old and had come from Al-Lajun, which was close to her home. But yet they were forbidden from making the distance journey across that checkpoint region. And so the work became very much not only a visitation to those spaces, but also conducting wishes that had been offered by those who I found across the borders. As you may know, the Jewish National Fund supported many of the afforestation campaigns in the sweep between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And so when one visits villages such as this, Suba, the afforestation with conifers that grow quickly, the acidic pine needles of which smother the gardens of the prior inhabitation, it's almost impossible to find the remnants of that prior village. And when one speaks about those things, I was saying to the class yesterday, it's very important not to speak in a manner which is overly inflected. I decided that the facts of the space, of what had transpired in the 1948 period and beyond, was the best means by which to speak to that issue, to that history, to honor that space. 3 generations of the Mahmoud family in al-Fahim, and Beit Jibrin in the Hebron district. Munir and Shufat refugee camp. Munir offered me a testimony of his childhood at Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin was the area that was the site of one of the greatest massacres in the history of the depopulation of the villages. And he spoke of how his uncle and his elder brothers were massacred in front of him. And then he was taken to the border and said to go to Abdallah, to Jordan. He had not visited back his village in the intervening 60 years. But in speaking about his memories of that space, it was so completely precise, so capable was one of finding the history laden beneath his words. And curiously, in a recent exhibition, his testimony was accompanying the exhibition with the portrait. And the wake of its closure, there was a meeting of critics. And the New York Times critic suggested that this testimony had in fact been concocted, that it was invented. So imagine, as a child, to lose your uncle, to lose your siblings, and then to have the further trauma of imagining that your history was denied you, your own story was denied you. Something that is incapable to conceive when you think of the other side of the equation. And it seemed to me that this work was very much about honoring a history. If we wish to move forward beyond the sort of rancor of these times, we have to accept basic facts of history. It's not taboo to talk about the start of the State of Israel. It's not taboo to talk about the history and the facts of the depopulation of those villages. And during the time that I was working on Memory Trace, I was invited to the southern Negev by a family that was living in the Al-Araqib unrecognized village. It was an area I didn't know as much of the regions I visited early on. And I arrived in the afternoon. It was a sweltering summer day in the outskirts of Beersheba. And I sat with the elder Sheikh in a tent out beyond the perimeter of the cemetery. What one sees here is the footprint of the cemetery at center and the fenced area of the compound within which there are still some buildings. But all of the sweep beyond it had been the area of 40 to 50 houses only weeks before. And I sat with him in under one of those makeshift tents, looking out across this expanse. And it was impossible to imagine what that space must have been like only weeks before, right? The stories of the families that had lived there, that had been moved from that space into the nearby townships that were envisioned by the Israeli state. And yet, so confounding was it to look across this distant plain. It was the first time that I realized it was essential to see the context, to understand what that space looked like within the broader sweep of the Negev. And so for the first time in my life, I flew aloft above the land, looking down from a bird's eye perspective, thinking about what had been there prior. And what one sees here, in fact, is the beginnings of the Ambassador Forest, which is a green belt that was imagined to encircle the town of Beersheba. And so it was an excuse, a means by which to raise the unrecognized villages to the ground and to move those communities onward. There's Sheikh on the first day of our encounter. And the work from Desert Bloom, the second part of the trilogy, was very much a consideration of what Ben-Gurion's invocation to make the desert bloom had meant in the intervening years between 1948 and today. I flew aloft with a former Air Force pilot in a small Cessna with the door off. And he instructed me about the land we were seeing. Many things I didn't understand at the time of first encounter. And slowly I began to realize what it was actually I was looking at. Slowly I began to decipher the clues. There were areas of militarization. There were areas of further inhabitation, current unrecognized villages, and the history laden beneath. Here, for instance, is one of the images of the unrecognized village, again, of Al-Arakib, with the troughs prepared in advance of the rains so that ambassadors may come and plant seedlings for the forest that will be in the future. The only ambassador that refused to plant tree seedlings in that space was the South African ambassador, who said that he had already lived through apartheid and he didn't intend to do so again. Each of the images, as you'll see in the exhibition, has attendant coordinates, and there's a small brochure through which you can then read about the forensic underpinnings of what one is looking at. In particular, there is the opportunity to look at Google Earth and to think of the timeline. For instance, this space, the edge of Al-Arakib, which is then held as a potential nature preserve, is held in abeyance of a future transformation. Here we see a sweep of about 10 years, I think, 2011, 2012, 13, later that year, and later again. In fact, the nature preserve had been used to hold that land open, to wrest it from the Bedouin community that lived there, and to keep it open until such a time as they could construct the Ashkelon Railway, which is what you see going directly through the heart of what were the troughs of the forested area. Other aspects were difficult to decipher initially. These three areas are called seer. Seer are what the Bedouin used to term the areas and the enclosures for the flocks of sheep during any given cycle of the year. As they are nomadic, as they move on from that space, one imagines, how do we assert ongoing inhabitation of a space? And so what one sees here is the most recent seer is the middle top right. And since they are burned each year before the family moves on, the left one will represent a second year, and the third at bottom right is the third year, proof of return to land. Again, here you see it in situ in the village of Abu Asa, as well unrecognized and threatened with demolition. But there you see the dark patch of this year, the year prior, and perhaps 2 or 3 years faded prior to that. During the Nabatean era, you see the history. That which cannot be seen on the ground is seen only from aloft. The fenced area would have ringed the circle of the space. You see the halos of the foundations, and then you see the main square at left, accessed from a path from the left side of the image. These are pitas, which are military installations used to mimic installations that would be across the borders in Egypt, Lebanon, Syria. British Mandate era weapons storage spaces. And this area is a mock landing strip used for bombing practice with dummy bombs. Most of these areas today, given the volatility along the Gazan border, are now enclosed areas. But for me, it was an opportunity to be open to be vulnerable, to be receptive to the clues that the land holds for us, and to then ask prior Air Force pilots to share their knowledge of what it is we were looking at, in order that they could help me unravel the history of that space. A current military training camp of the Lions. And as we will see in the American Southwest, the idea that nuclear waste or other toxic wastes may be simply disposed of in the desert without any great proximity to local populations, without any concern, indeed, of local populations. Here we see the halo of a former unrecognized village. In the north is a live fire zone up at the top, and then we see the halos, the berms of what was protecting the sides of the foundations. And a smuggler's route from the Sinai northward, used for drugs and human trafficking. And then I turned back to look more specifically with Eyal Weizman, the British-Israeli architect who runs forensic architecture in London. And we wanted to find a means by which to more rigorously assert the history of Al-Araqib and the presence of the village from a time before the start of the State of Israel. We took documents from the families within the village. They included IDs, voter IDs, from the time of early days of the Israeli occupation. That we took a 1945 British Mandate era image from just after the liberation of Auschwitz and interrogated that 9 by 9 inch piece of negative to find the areas that considered and corresponded with the areas in Al-Araqib that exist still to this day. The dams of the stream are at the right. The cemetery can be seen as the sort of light area in the upper right-hand side of the image. And here we have close-ups from within the image that show the dams on the bottom left, the cistern on the bottom right, the foundation of Nouri Aluppi's father in the left middle, and the tents of the families in the top right. An image from 1945, and then a ground truthing image I took of the same cistern that year in 2013. And the house, the foundations of the house of Nouri Aluppi's father, and then the ground truthing image of that space today. And indeed, the cemetery itself, which has one of the graves which dates back to the early part of the 20th century, well before the founding of the State of Israel. All of these documents were used at various moments to support the argument of the residents for their right to remain in the village. And indeed, in the time since we were working with them, the village has been razed to the ground more than 120 times. Each of the court cases has failed, with the insistence that the families must move within the townships that were aligned for them. The third piece is called Independence Nakba. I was curious about how one articulates that expanse of time between 48 and when I was working, which was 2013. Not only for the sense of that sweep of time, but also for the sense of the scars, the wounds riven upon those who had inhabited that space in the wake of that separation, that cataclysmic year, 1948. And I decided to take pairs of images, diptychs, every year from 2013 back to the pivotal year in 1948. The only text in that book is about how each spring the Israelis celebrate the independence of the country, which is the same time that the Palestinians mark the Nakba, which is known as the catastrophe. I just show you about 5 of those diptychs. And what's curious for me, not only in the exhibition here, but more pointedly in the book, is that when you hold it in your hands, you're obliged at any particular moment to attend more fully to one image than the other. Is it a question of allegiance? It is a question of empathy? Or is it also a question of the complexity of those relationships and our interaction with those relationships? It's only when you make your way through the book slowly that you begin to unravel the signifiers, begin to see which may be the Israeli and which may be the Palestinian. So close is the physiognomy in many instances. And the last pair, born in the pivotal year of 1948. To imagine that these were communities who lived astride one another, often speaking one another's language, speaking Arabic, speaking Hebrew. And yet that pivotal time had created a barrier between them which has not been surmounted in the years since. When I came back from that work, it was about 2016. And the next year I had a fellowship at Dartmouth, and I gave a lecture, and in the audience was a writer whom I admire greatly, Terry Tempest Williams, who happens to be with her this evening. Her work in the early 90s in Refuge, that piece had been absolutely pivotal for me at a moment of loss in my own family. And she asked the next day if we might meet one another for breakfast, for coffee. And we sat together, and she suggested to me, would it be of interest for you to come out to the Four Corners area to consider again the American Southwest? And in particular, her interest was connected to the work of Utah Diné Bikeya, which is the 5-tribe coalition, Hopi, Navajo, Ute Mountain Ute, and Zuni Puebloan communities that were struggling for the right to retain Bears Ears National Monument as a place, a sacred space of protection within the nation's psyche. I was, of course, very timid about that, having worked 5 years in an extremely complicated place in Israel, Palestine. But only a few weeks later, I was so tempted by the prospect of visiting. So kind of enamored also of her work, but similarly of what these tribes were attempting to do and what they had laid aside in order to accomplish this monument status. And I arrived at their home in Castle Valley, Utah, and the next day, Terry and I drove down the 2.5 hours to Bluff. It was the annual meeting of Utah Diné Bikeya, and we sat in this room in Design Bluff, around a table at which was seated a host of these tribal members, women, men, of all those communities, and yet they were there in the service of a common goal. There was no rancor that may have been a historical difference between those tribes. There was only a sense of this common love of the lands that they inhabit and the spaces that they hold dear. And I thought, I spent so much of my life as a person of color trying to unravel the various strains within me, to reconcile them, to think about my heritage in Kenya and Afghanistan. And here I was, somebody who's been interested in working across borders of gender, across borders of language, race, community. I was sitting amongst 5 tribes that have put their differences aside. I was also sitting with Terry, whose home is Utah, who has also been severely impacted by the legacy of what has transpired in those lands with the test site bombings or detonations. And I felt this extreme, not only vulnerability, but admiration for what they had accomplished. And at the end of that day, we sort of presented ourselves, and it had been at their invitation that we were there initially, and they voted right away, and they very kindly asked if I would be an artist in residence to work with the Bears Ears movement and Utah Dinebikeya. And I spent the next months traveling to and fro from that region. I didn't know, as with Israel, what it was that I might be able to find, what might strike a chord with my own work. And yet, since I had just been working from an aerial perspective in Israel's Negev, I thought, oh, let me look at the footprint of Bears Ears. Let me see what that space looks like, and let me try and imagine my way back into the space I had not visited in 30 years. And yes, I was interested in images and encounters like this, which are of the extraordinary beauty, the surreal character of the footprint of Bears Ears and beyond in the Red Rock Desert. But I was also really drawn and really terrified by the threat that the new president was putting out there, that he might strip the borders of Bears Ears in the coming months. And so I looked actually most pointedly at the surroundings of that, as I suggested. This, before I carry on with that, this is an image of Loretta Posey. She passed away last week. She was one of the women who was at that initial meeting. But in those days, the board member with whom she was visiting was Mary Jane Yazzie. They're both Ute, and they were working together on the Ute dictionary. I never met her properly and more than somewhat retiring and silent for the longest time, until I visited her repeatedly in the last couple of years. And she, in fact, embodied what many of these women within that community have held for me. It's a kind of an enduring strength in a matriarchal society, matrilineal society. But also, not only had they succeeded in winning Bears Ears not only once, but fully twice, in effect, they were standing up in a realm that had been particularly patriarchal. In the time after Bears Ears was won again, they instituted, with Terry's collaboration, the Women of Bears Ears, and they are today a force to be reckoned with. It's a portrait of Mary Benali. But what I was curious about was the threat of what would happen if Trump indeed stripped the status of the monument. And I was looking primarily at the history of uranium, oil and gas, and coal. And I found, for instance, this remediation site at Mexican Hat in San Juan County, only about 10 miles away from Jonah's house. And when I showed the image to Jonah, he didn't know what it was. He'd never seen that space from the aerial perspective, obviously, and he didn't realize the severity of the scar that it had riven upon the land. Jonah's sister, Lola Yellowman, I began also taking testimonies of those who had worked in the mines. They were never offered any information about the hazards that they were being subjected to. And in fact, the Navajo will tell you when you meet them that you shouldn't you shouldn't pierce the skin of the land, that there are dangers and there are forces held within which must be respected. And yet at the time in the 50s, when the nuclear industrial complex was ramping up its strengths, the Navajo, many of them, agreed to go into the mines to help the nation in its endeavor with the war. But yet these miners, as you will see in some of the testimonies in the exhibition above, would arrive in the morning at the mine shaft and would be told by the white manager what to do that day in the depths below the surface. They would descend that 500 feet into the bowels of the earth. They would work unprotected in that space. They would take their lunch, dusting off their clothes and eating their sandwiches, drawing water from the walls that was running down the caves, drinking that. Only latterly did they begin to realize the severity of that which they were being subjected to, when the members of their family began dying and wasting from the cancer. Tom, a teen who worked for decades in the mines as a driller, had lost his hearing at the time I met him. This is an image only from last year, in fact, made near Oljato in Monument Valley. Ambrosia Lake from the area of Grants, which was the center of the extraction of uranium in those days. Church Rock also from New Mexico, something that none of us in the room probably have heard of before. Church Rock, in fact, was the second greatest radioactive breach in the world history, second only to Chernobyl. In 1979, the berm containment area that was holding back the waste was breached in the early morning, and the effluent flowed into the Puerco River. Has been flowing, the remnants of that, I should say, have been flowing down the river ever since, moving inexorably into the Navajo Nation proper. I keep this image close to my heart because it's connected to a friend of mine, Dr. Tommy Rock, whom we were able to bring to Princeton. He's a hydrologist, and he was studying the impacts of this radiation upon the communities in Sanders, Arizona. He, in fact, will be here next week as part of the Environmental Justice Symposium. I think it's on the 13th or the 14th of October, and we'll be speaking about not only his work, but the exhibition upstairs. Coal as well on the borders. And what one also has to acknowledge is the fact that when these coal plants are ended, when they let their labor force go after decades of work, you may be in one way removing a hazard to their lives or mitigating a hazard to their lives. But we also have to remember that those people have depended for their livelihood upon the work in the mines. They need some sort of redress. They need some sort of alternative way forward. This is Jack Cly, who worked in the coal mines for 3 decades. Southern border of Arizona, the Silver Bell copper mine. Oil and gas is one of the projects in methane that we've worked on rather pointedly with this group at Princeton with which I'm working. It's a cross-disciplinary group, a cohort that involves myself and 2 geoscientists, a methane expert, a hydrologist, and the English professor, Eduardo Cadava, as well as native scholars from the region, including Dr. Tommy Rock. I flew above some of the fracking areas in the Uinta Range at the time when the Mormon midwife, Donna Young, was speaking out about the way in which infant mortality was rising in the region, and she was decrying the expansion of the oil and gas leases around her area. And yet, as a midwife of decades of work within her own community, she was threatened by those who were in close connection to the oil and gas concerns. When I arrived back down at Aneth, Monument Creek, Montezuma Creek, I met this man, Norman Sam, who's a shepherd of more than 80 years working in the canyons, tending his flock. Ever since the age of 6, he'd been out every day in the canyons. He spoke about how in the 1950s, the canyon in which his family and he lived, in which he set out about shepherding each day, was visited with a new infrastructure of the oil and gas companies. And within months, they had to move from that canyon to the adjacent canyon. So strong was the odor in the areas and so toxic. I decided to make a test in a way. He said the area, the facility that was merely 150 yards from his home, he claimed was certainly full of leaks. And the company, when they went to petition them, the company denied that there were any such leaks in the area. And what you will see in the coming video, which was made with a FLIR camera, a camera which enables one to render the methane which is invisible to the naked eye. If you look to the second from the left and the second from the top, that image, you will see during the video that this holding tank in fact has a fissure on the top. I'm going to attempt to switch to the video. What the FLIR camera enables one to do is to see areas that are either flaring or are dormant that you cannot see with the naked eye. And I showed this to the methane experts at Princeton, who have then come with me in the intervening period. We're developing a drone, that has a sensor that can fly within these given plumes, as you've seen in that left panel, and that can indeed measure the level of toxins within a given plume that is visualized. Yesterday, one of those scientists sent me a piece which says, among the flares monitored by an organization known as Plant et al., only 55 to 76% of the gas sent to flares was methane, and the remainder likely included volatile organic compounds and hazardous air pollutants such as benzene. In the US, an estimated 18 million people live within 2 kilometers of an oil and gas well, and 500,000 people live within 5 kilometers of an active flare in the Permian Basin, the Eagle Ford Basin, and the Bakken Basin in North Dakota, Montana. Unlit and completely combusted flares may expose nearby communities to a cocktail of co-pollutants that pose health risks. This is an image from Bakersfield, California, a swath, a 9 by 9 mile swath in the outskirts of Oildale. This is Willie Gray Eyes. The last thing I'll say about the exposure piece is that Terry and I went to a further meeting just in advance of the stripping of the status of the monument Bears Ears. And during that dinner after the meeting, Terry and I were sitting across from Willie, and he said, you know, this is really an extraordinary opportunity for Trump. He could show the tribes how much healing he could offer by not only retaining Bears Ears, but increasing the footprint to its originally proposed limit of 1.9 million acres. And we thought, oh, what what a notion of forgiveness. What in fact a generous invitation that would be. He wrote a letter, an open letter, which was to be a sort of op-ed piece. And Terry kindly attempted to have that positioned in one of the periodicals, the New York Times, the Washington Post. In each and every instance, there was not only either no response at all or a cryptic denial, a cryptic refusal. How is it possible that when thinking about these substantive issues in the environment, that we're not able to listen to one of the most extraordinary native thinkers of our time? They completely and simply erased his voice. And so what we made in the intervening period, we decided on our own to distribute at the various rallies, to make a piece that not only honored Willie's voice and his letter, but also the history of the proclamation which Obama had made, which made Bears Ears Monument a possibility, and a piece by Terry which talked about the history of her life in that region. I think in some ways that, gathering community around us is the only alternative. When we're shut down on so many different levels, it's the only opportunity to speak positively and constructively rather than with anger. The last piece which I'd like to share with you is perhaps the most difficult, and maybe that's why it's very hard for me to speak about any of this work today, is that I spent about 3 years working on this project here for this museum, and in concert with people who I admire and respect and who are my dear friends. They're my family. And Jonah Yellowman, as I said, was to be here. In fact, during the course of the pandemic, I was in Europe, and as many of you know, the Navajo Nation was stricken terribly by the pandemic. And yet, they rallied around one another. They brought and left food at the doorsteps of the elders. They wanted to protect their history. They were exceptionally generous. They were extremely strict with the protocols. Jonah himself lost his brother and his namesake, his son, within 1 week. I spoke to him the other day and I said, Jonah, how much of that which we have shared do you want me to share with the group at Yale? And he said, they need to learn. You can share whatever you want to tell them. And we talked often during that time, and I was asked to do an exhibition for the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. They were celebrating their 40th anniversary, and they asked 20-odd artists from the span of their years, supporting artists, to participate in a work called Towards Common Cause. I would have, under normal circumstances, focused upon the exposure material, but I felt so blighted by the pandemic. It was right in the midst of all those harrowing months that we were living through. And I was hunkered down with my partner Alexandra in Zurich, speaking on occasion to Jonah, who was hunkered down at home in Monument Valley. And then we started to speak about what we could do. And we thought, actually, what we need now is not more rancor, more anger, more bombast. We need a space which is healing. We need a space which is calm and loving, and within which we could sit and exist on our own without it feeling as a threat. So many of us being alone in our homes, we're assailed, we're upended, we're depressed by that time. He wanted, we wanted to make a space that was healing in nature, protective in nature. And so I said to the people in Chicago, I said, no, I don't feel up to the task. I can only do this if I collaborate with the people who are my community, who have welcomed me and can inform this process. And so I invited, by extension, Jonah and the geoscientist, Jeff Moore, who works at the University of Utah. And the three of us discussed what kind of installation we could make. And at some point, I said to Jonah what I might be interested in terms of visual aspects could be something about untrammeled landscape, right? And a landscape which is not necessarily legible in terms of scale or proximity, but which is immersive and tactile and loving. And he said, yeah. And he said, okay, let me think about that. And I never, in all the months and years of our relationship, I never felt it appropriate to impose my will on him. I just kept talking to him when he'd ask me questions. And then one day he said, okay, the room has to be like this. When you leave the space, you have to head to the east. And I'm going to make an offering for you. I didn't ask him what the offering was. I trusted the nature of what he wanted to do, of what the healing he wanted to offer us. And he sent this piece along. In fact, it was extremely unusual. He sent it with Tommy Rock because we were worried about his travel at the time. And it was installed in Chicago with the utmost care, very unusually over Zoom, the preparators talking about exactly the manner in which things should be held, the way in which things should be open, all of it instructed by Jonah. The piece was up for 3 months in Chicago. Yale saw the piece, asked for that piece in its entirety to be installed here at this museum. The acting director of this museum wrote to request that piece directly to Jonah, naming all of the aspects of that piece. And I think that in some ways we accomplished what we had set out for. I believe that that space actually, when I stand within it, is meditative, is sonorous, is resonant, and is healing. A woman yesterday, one of the guards, I surprised her. Nobody else was in the upper reaches of the museum, and I walked into the room, and she was standing there with her hands down on the sound bench that Jeff Moore had made. She said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was just meditating." And I think that's exactly why you make work like this. Sadly, as I think Yechen and I will discuss afterwards, the offering has become an extremely complicated and divisive issue, and one which I find deeply saddens me. I feel like the level of impropriety that has been leveled against me, against him, against us, is beyond measure. Erasure. There was an offering, and it was refused. Erasure. Erasure. There was an offering, and it was rejected. There was an offering, and it was refused. Erasure. 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 I'm going to close with just one last piece for 2 minutes in silence. It's the piece that was offered by Jeff Moore and his team at Geohazards in Salt Lake City. Jeff very kindly put together a compilation of arches which he had represented with his team. They look at the fragility of those spaces, of threats to the structures themselves, and means by which to protect them over time. What I think initially touched me when I met him through Terry at her home, Jeff talked about, in the wake of that meeting, he talked about an invitation by the 6-tribe consultative committee in Arizona that was worried about Rainbow Bridge and the integrity of the arch, how it might be impacted by helicopters and airplanes flying above. And he and his team went down at the behest of the National Park Service and these 6 tribes. And they in fact determined that the resonance of the arch was exactly in sync with that of the helicopters that were approaching the arch, and indeed would multiply the means by which the arch would degrade. The most extraordinary thing in this collaboration was that they instituted not only a no-fly zone, but a set of months during which they wanted the arch to repair itself, during which it could not be approached at all, during which it could heal. And I play a compilation for you that he sent me yesterday, which is of 3 of the arches: Rainbow Bridge, Sipapu, and Castleton Tower. Thank you for listening.
We have time now for questions. I think, if I'm correct, that there's a microphone that can be passed around. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will wait for the microphone to be brought to you. Oh.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you. I saw the exhibit last week with Kishwar. I was lucky enough to have her walk me through it. So I feel fortunate to hear the talk today. I just had a question. As a Jewish woman whose family took me to Israel often from a young age, filled with the folklore of the people, how would you explain what you learned on that land of the displaced people to someone who's coming from the opposite perspective of a lifetime of tale?
You know, it's a curious thing to be in our position. You know, one night you can be with an Israeli family, experiencing the utmost hospitality, and the next evening across the checkpoint in the occupied territories with a Palestinian family, knowing that those two families would never meet one another, would never be in one another's homes. And for me, I think, you know, it's possible to meet people on an individual level and understand the profundity of connection that is possible there. I'm not by nature a combative person, so I was wanting to see both sides of an equation. I really started with that as my baseline. But over time, particularly, as you can imagine, my presentation, it was clear that I was often humiliated and marginalized. And that has a wearing quality which makes one really have to focus on not being furious. And I wanted to make work, I don't know if this succeeds in that regard, but I wanted to make work upstairs which is measured, which is honest, but which is measured. And I don't want it to be overly inflected, but I do want it to be honest to the history that I have seen. I thought it was very important to see those diptychs within the exhibition space. Somebody had suggested maybe leaving that out and just focusing more upon the memory trace aspect of things. But I think that part is extremely important, because it shows that these people who have come after the rift of that time, they bear the burden of that time, right? It's indelibly scarred them. And often it's very difficult for me to know how to communicate that to friends. I mean, it was extremely difficult to know how to communicate that to the Israelis with whom I was working in many instances. So, difficult to know how to say more than that.
Thank you for giving me that.
Are there other questions from the audience? I would, for the time being, to ask you something, Fazal. In our conversations, you've said before about photography that you don't have any room to hide in that medium, in that technique. And I feel like your work is so much about showing things that are trying to be hidden or, have a difficulty to be seen. So when you talk about having nowhere to hide in photography, can you expand more on what that means to you when you take photographs or when you look at them?
I mean, photography is diabolical in that way, because you know so much about the photographer by virtue of just looking at what they've made. I can tell you whatever I want about these images, but in interrogating them, you know everything about my sensibilities, which is the tricky nature of that medium. And I use it in a way, I mean, I was delighted to speak with some of the grad students in the last couple of days, because they understood that idea that you could use the process of making to try and interrogate and unravel things in a way that is instructive, educative for me, but also hopefully in sharing that messy process with others. It's the Israel work is a kind of an invitation to the space, which is not overly inflected in terms of my point of view. It's not dogmatic, but it hopefully kind of engenders a conversation which is substantive and generative. Mm-hmm. If that's what, if you get that.
Could you wait for the microphone, because other people might not be able to hear you? No, right there, next to you.
Yeah, so how did you come about your photographs? I mean, how high were you in a helicopter, or how did you do it?
In Israel, I was fortunate enough to meet a gentleman who had previously been an Air Force pilot, as most of the people who know about reading the land are. And he was keen to share that space with me. I think we had a good rapport. You fly without the door on and you see everything that is laying out before you as it comes to you, which is very different than a portrait, which is, a kind of setting up of space wherein you want a rapport, a kind of exchange of openness. The landscape is much more meditative. And not only are you learning by looking at it, you're learning by virtue of the person who is also sharing their love of that space with you, Well, actually, I have a question. I have struggled with this idea of this offering deeply for many weeks, and I find it unsettling to say the least. I mean, when I speak about Jonah, when he was invited to be here, that was going to be such a gift for your community. We talk about the complexities of Yale and the Peabody, and yet you had one of the most extraordinary living tribal members who has been amongst a group that saved 1.35 million acres for the nation moving forward, sacred landscapes. How could we treat somebody like that with such disrespect is something I can hardly countenance. And I haven't gotten a satisfactory answer for why that happened. Right? This exhibition was in Chicago for 3 months. We sat then only a few weeks ago planning to come and be here together. His son, Eric, has never been to the East Coast before. It was such a joyous moment. I mean, my friends here who have helped shepherd this project through 3 years were to be here with us. And we sat on a Zoom call. We are all talking to an elder. When I correspond for Jonah or with Jonah, I do so as a kind of secretary, because I know he doesn't have facility with email and so forth, but I know that I'm talking to an elder. I know that I'm talking to somebody that I should regard. And I know that somebody of his stature needs to talk to somebody of an equal stature from another community. When we brought them to Princeton, when I was a visiting professor 3 years ago, we brought 14 elders there. It was the first time Princeton had had such a large group visit. It was extraordinary. We took them to the sea. His first question here was, how do I meet? Who do I meet? Who do I need to be in discussion with to gain permission for a blessing, to a shared blessing, an offering? When he came to Princeton, he met with the Lenape elder Curtis Zuniga. Together we went to the shore, and they asked to make a blessing together in that space. It was absolutely the most curative, sort of generative moment I have experienced probably in my life. And what we have accomplished here is we have ripped the heart out of a piece that was born of collaboration and love, and I simply don't understand why. And I'm not getting an answer as to what happened.
Well, Fazal, you know, in my position, I can tell you the museum's position. I can tell you what you have already heard many times. But I think that I will just speak with candor as someone whose own position is precarious within this institution. Someone, you know, who is up here, but will not be up here for many more times. That I'm sorry, but I think what you're getting at is a question of whose communities are being listened to. Because I also think that there are communities here for whom that was not okay, and with whom we consulted and talked to. And I can't, because I wasn't part of those discussions, I can't recount them, I can't articulate them, but I can only repeat what they shared with me, which is that they did not agree that it should be displayed.
So essentially you have a situation wherein, and what I must say to you is that for you to be in this position is an extremely fragile reality, and I appreciate across the board your candor during our time together. I think it's in a way unfair to be speaking for the museum in that way. But I have to say that if it is an amorphous group that remains unnamed, that an elder hasn't the opportunity to be in discussion or even participate in the viewing of his pieces, is, in a moment when we're talking about trauma and disrespect, is visiting the very same trauma and disrespect on another, right? Right? And this is profound. Yes?
So, well, first of all, as a first-year PhD student here, I'm very disappointed to hear this side of the institutional politics, and especially as you're mentioning, the irony of the exhibition's nature of displacement, of erasure, and then having institutional violence itself being replicated. How would you like, it's because this is now a different exhibition from what you initially had in mind. How does this institutional violence, should we as an audience then register it when we're interacting with this exhibition? How should, like, the institutional, I mean, it's a new object in a way, one born out of violence from a very powerful institution who has made the conscious decision after viewing this object to just, as you said, reject an offering.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's a different iteration of the project. The project is the piece in its entirety, which has been censored. And so what are one's options? I mean, my first priority was to be allied with my friend. My work was also censored in that regard. His work was absolutely censored. But I was heartened by the sense that the director, who had actually requested formally this specific piece, this piece which had been displayed in Chicago for 3 months, as I said, which was part of visits by elders of various communities, expressed a wish not only to apologize, but to atone. And, what does that mean? Like, words of apology. But if it doesn't come with some substantive gesture of embodied experience, of genuine shift. I mean, I said in the moment that we were really at rupture, I said, look, here is an opportunity. And that's precisely what Jonah told me the other day. He said, those people haven't listened to us for generations, and they're still not listening to us. But what is this teaching all about? They need to start listening, and they need to change for a better future. And this was the kind of promise I thought, if the director genuinely wants to shift, it shouldn't be about cancel culture, this was a moment like, get rid of him, That's insufferable, What about the idea of just like slow, marked, inexorable change? Messy, we did it wrong, we apologize, we'd like to do it better. Wow. I mean, I think I want that level of forgiveness for myself if I'm genuinely sorry. And that was the reason why it was worth not closing the whole exhibition, because I thought this could be a moment, a kind of messy moment, but if the museum wants to move forward, what a great example that is for other museums in such a position, right?
We are at our time, and this is not because I want you to stop. But I will make my own comment on this. I appreciate your candor, Fazal, and I think that that's something that has always been good about our discussions, because I was there for some of the really, heated moments. And I will say that, there are people with whom I work at this museum who I trust a lot, who I trust, and in some sense I am up here on their behalf because they do not wish to speak. And I think of them I take their opinions seriously when they felt that there could be violence inflicted as well by the presence of the offering.
But
that
who
was
are these
at least.
people? Who are these people?
I don't want to name them because I don't want to make them targets. I don't want to assign blame to them.
But it's okay for me and for Jonah to be targets. I mean, that's the difference.
I'm
it's
up
a
here.
personality talking about against an institution of power. How is it that you can assail something? And now this is not you, but how is it that an extraordinarily powerful institution like this can just willfully say, no, that's inappropriate, without offering the opportunity to confront one's accusers? I mean, I simply can't countenance how that happens. And yet it happens again and again and again.
This is not a solution. This is not this doesn't fix anything. But I remember before you came here this week, you said something like, things have been incredibly wobbly, right? I think that this exhibition is at its moment wobbly, and that the decision now is to make sure that it falls in the right place. And I don't want to cut you off, but this is our time, and we're going to conclude here. Thank you all for being here and for listening to Fazal speak. It was really gracious of you to speak holistically about the project and the exhibition. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Fazal.
Thank you.